Welcome to the fifth and final video in our study of the book of Daniel, specifically the apocalyptic prophecies of Daniel in Daniel 7 through 12. The first half of the book of Daniel is historical in character from two different historical periods, 4 chapters from 605, 604 BC, and shortly thereafter perhaps, and then chapters 5 and 6 from the time of the fall of Babylon, 539. Both chapter 5 and chapter 6 should be dated in that time frame. Then we come to chapters 7 through 12. We have apocalyptic visions, prophecies concerning the future of God's people, not in chronological order with the rest of the book. And we have seen some amazing things in the second video of chapter 7, after an introductory video of historical context. Then the third video from chapter 8, the fourth video, chapter 9, some amazing ways in which what actually happened corresponds to the exact numbers that are mentioned by the angel Gabriel in explaining the vision of chapter 8, what will happen to the Jewish people with the coming of Cyrus after 49 years. With the murder of the high priest Onias after 434 years, 62 sevens, 7 years of the reign of terror of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. The Greeks, under the reign of Antiochus, came and destroyed the city and the sanctuary, exactly what we were reading in chapter 9. There were wars, there were desolations, some of the Jews willing to make a covenant with Antiochus. But in 167, he desecrated the temple, brought in sacrifices of pig's blood, decreed that the sacrifices and the offerings of Judaism should no longer be made. The final 7 ends with a significant date. That is the date of the death of Antiochus. We have looked at those matters in detail. I encourage you to review them. What an amazing story. And to me, most amazing is the way in which prophecy, correctly understood, so clearly came to pass in the events of our world, once again validating the word of God in the Old Testament prophets. When we come to Daniel chapter 10, we come to the year 537. Daniel saw a vision of a man who served as a heavenly messenger. Daniel saw a man dressed as a priest, glorious but human, verse 16, verse 19, or 18 rather. Daniel's prayer had been heard, but a 3-week delay had occurred because of the prince of the Persian kingdom. We're not going to say much here about spiritual or celestial beings, but the context seems to refer to spiritual warfare in the heavenly realm. Persia has a representative in the heavenly realm, as does Greece, verse 20. Michael, verse 21, represents God's people. And these descriptions may anticipate Paul's descriptions of spiritual warfare in Ephesians chapter 6. You may also be interested in Isaiah chapter 24, specifically verses 21 and 22. This spiritual warfare is directed against Persia and then against Greece, both of which had previously had power over God's people. The message is that God's people would survive. The battle would be won. The book of truth that contains God's records of the course of future history is referenced. And then there's some imprecision because actually the first verse of chapter 11 belongs with chapter 10. Because of the brevity of chapter 10, we're going to continue on and also conclude the book, even though this final video will perhaps be a bit longer. This chapter is a continuation of the storyline of chapter 10. Again, the year 537, 2 kings, the king of the south, the king of the north are described. And I want to show you how that story continues throughout the chapter. Daniel mentions 3 kings who will be followed by a 4th, stirring up conflict against Greece. This could be kind of a Hebrew figure of speech, as in Amos 1 and 2, for 3 yet for 4 transgressions. The emphasis may not be on the number, but on the result. But if we have to identify 3 Persian kings, we could think about Cambyses, 530 to 522 BC, Guamata, 522, and Darius I, 522 to 486. Then the 4th would be Xerxes, who attempted to conquer Greece in 480. Verses 3 and 4 describe the Grecian Empire after the death of Philip III, Alexander's half-brother, and Alexander IV. Then the kingdom of Alexander the Great was divided among his generals. The text says, not to his descendants. I'm not going to take time to cite all of the verses specifically. I have them cited generally for you, so you can read the verses that I have cited, verses 3 and 4. You can find the phrases I'm mentioning. Not to his descendants. 2 generals would eventually become dominant, Seleucus and Ptolemy. That would be the Egyptians under Ptolemy and the Seleucids in the area we know as Palestine. That's the story that we're going to specifically see. This is still an expansion of the reference in chapter 7 to the kings and the little horn king that uprooted previous kings. Now, Seleucus began as a general for Ptolemy. Verse 5, a little bit of a review of history. The result was that the kings of the Seleucids in the north, the kings of the Ptolemies in the south, and Judah caught in the middle. So the 2 forces forged an alliance with the marriage of Berenice, the daughter of Ptolemy II, to Antiochus II. So these 2 kingdoms, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, they were united by the marriage of offspring. And both of those were killed by Laodice, the former wife of Antiochus, verse 6, so that Berenice's brother, Ptolemy III, then killed Laodice, and there was a battle between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies throughout the latter part of the 3rd century. That's what we're reading really basically in verses 7 through 10. In verses 11 through 13, we read about the king of the south, that's Ptolemy IV. He defeated Antiochus III in 217. Greek history says that Antiochus III lost 10,000 men. So that by verse 14, as we move on and back and through this text historically, we have Ptolemy V, Antiochus III, successful. Antiochus gave his daughter, Cleopatra, to Ptolemy V in marriage in 194. And then Antiochus was defeated by the Roman commander in 190, eventually died in 187. And you see all of this in verse 17, verse 18, verse 19. The successor was his son Seleucus IV, brother to Cleopatra. He was killed, the victim of a conspiracy against him, verse 20. After which his brother Antiochus IV, we've talked a lot about him in this video series, usurped the throne and began to rule instead of the rightful heir, the son of Seleucus IV. That would have been Demetrius I. That would be verse 21. Thus, Antiochus IV is described as one who was not given the honor of royalty. He seized it. In 170 BC, Onias III, the high priest, was murdered. The reading, Prince of the Covenant, verse 22, so that Antiochus IV was securely in power with the support of only a few people. The further exploits of Antiochus IV in his battles against Ptolemy V in Egypt, or Ptolemy VI, in Egypt, are described in verses 24 through 27. In verse 28, he returns to the Holy Land and plunders the temple. That happened in 169 BC. So this section, verses 24 through 35, is talking to us about various events that we know occurred because of the history, the story of the Maccabees that is a part of Old Testament apocryphal literature, other documents, other literature as well. We know the story. We know what happened historically. And Antiochus then invaded the south again. He was not successful. He returned to the Holy Land. He desecrated the temple with the abomination of desolation, 29 through 31. Those verses, he led unfaithful Jews away from the covenant. The majority of the Jews resisted him. Verse 32, many Jewish leaders were killed. Verse 33, the resistance continued until the time of his decreed death. Verses 34, 35, although his death is not actually told until verse 45. So this brief summary, I hope, makes clear that the kings of the Ptolemies or the kings of the Seleucids are the subject of chapter 11. The kings of the south, the kings of the north, clearly in verses 5 through 20, a more focused description of Antiochus IV in verses 21 through 45, that the entire last section of this chapter refers to Antiochus IV must be the case, despite the tendency of so many commentators to apply the last verses of the chapter to far distant events, identifying an antichrist who is never even mentioned in the text, inserting matters that are only speculation, apart from that which the text clearly says. My point is that all of the events that are being described in this section are clearly references to the events that we see in history during the battles and the conflicts between the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids further to the north. Again, Judah caught in the middle. So let us read what the text says and compare it to what we know in history, and then try to determine what exactly is being said. I want to move on in the text. I've noted that as we read verses 24 through 35 and eventually in verse 45, the death of Antiochus, all of that clearly is talking about Antiochus. Now let's come to this section to conclude the chapter 11, verses 36 through 45. Verse 36 reveals the disdain of Antiochus for religion, especially Judaism. He used the title God in reference to himself, and even on coins. He suppressed all other religions, conflicting with the God of gods, the God of Israel, a reference in 1 Maccabees 1:24. And he continues until God's wrath is poured out upon him. The time is complete. The time of the end has come as God decrees. In verse 37, we remember as we read the text and we think about history, Apollos eventually replaced Zeus. Antiochus made the decision to replace Apollos with Zeus, disregarding the religious practice of his father. And all of the other gods were either removed or slighted, and he recognized only himself as supreme and put other gods in the pantheon below him, verse 38. Verse 39, he fortified the city of Jerusalem, but he did that to honor foreign gods. There's a reference in 1 Maccabees 1:33 to 34 if you want to look at it. His governance was highly politicized, so that he promoted those who supported him. A great deal of nepotism, a great deal of favoritism. Offices were for sale, and that happened and continued. That success was permitted until the time of God's wrath. We read a little of that in verse 36, until the time of the end. The same expression was used in verse 35 to describe the end of the reign of Antiochus. It's repeated here. This part of the chapter is summarizing the career and the end of Antiochus. Nothing in the text indicates a change of subjects. There's no reason for us to insert some unknown antichrist figure from the end of time. The repeated reference to the king of the south throughout this entire section suggests just the opposite. We're talking about the king of the south, the king of the north, two kingdoms that were in opposition to one another, especially in the first part of the 2nd century before Christ. In verses 40 through 43, the historical summary continues. After the attack of the king of the south, Antiochus had some success. He was in control of the Holy Land, also of Edom and Moab, and much of the territory of the Ammonites. In his desire to conquer the nations, Egypt did not escape his attention. And then we come to the last two verses of the chapter, possibly a reference to the time shortly after his triumph over Egypt. He was called home and he sought to destroy Judaism with a fury. But this may also be a reference to a threat from the east, from the Parthians. Even though he had inhabited that area, had some control over that area, he did not die there. He met his end in Persia, right on schedule, with God's timetable, God's wrath, and the decreed time of the end. So the vision of chapters 10 through 12 completes the sequence of the apocalyptic prophecies, all of them relating to the same time period. All of these relating to the events that would occur from the time of Daniel by the time Daniel saw the first prophecy, Babylon was still in control, 553, but eventually in the subsequent prophecy, Babylon had fallen, Cyrus in control, as had been prophesied in chapter 8, explained in chapter 9. All of these so interesting. Chapter 7, 553 BC, chapter 8, 551 BC, chapter 9, 539, an explanation of the prophecy of chapter 8, and then 2 years later, chapters 10 through 12. Let us briefly look at chapter 12 and see how the sequence continues to conclude the book of Daniel. Here are the dates that I just mentioned, showing that we have a series of apocalyptic prophecies all related to the same basic time period, talking about from the time of Babylon, then the time of the Medo-Persians, up to the time of the fourth kingdom, the ungodly kingdom of chapter 7, explained again in chapter 8, the explanation of the vision in chapter 9, always focused on Antiochus, also chapter 11. And so now we come to chapter 12. Very briefly, 2 slides remain. This short chapter concludes the prophetic apocalyptic section, also concludes the book of Daniel. Verses 1 through 4, in the time of Antiochus IV, Michael will fight for God's people and deliver them. There is no doubt God will win, even over Antiochus, even though it was a time of great tribulation in the midst of distress. Deliverance will come. This vision was to be sealed until the time of the end, but when the end came, then the vision would be completed. God's people would be restored. This is not a reference to the end of the world, the end of time. This is a reference to the end of the time of Antiochus, verses 1 through 4. Verses 5 through 13, a time of distress, time times half a time. That may mean it won't be forever. It'll be partial. 3.5 is half of 7. But also, it may be a reference to the 3.5 years that the temple sacrificial system was interrupted, abolished by the decree of Antiochus. But finally, in verse 13, we have a consolation, instructions to Daniel to live his life. He will not live to see all of these things. Now, we do want to say a bit more about making sense of all of the numbers that we've seen, the timetable that we've seen. How do we deal with the desolation of the temple by Antiochus IV in about 3.5 years? The numbers set forth are 2,300 mornings and evenings, about 1,150 days. And then we had another reference to 1,290 days and another reference to 1,335 days. So let's look at a timetable that perhaps can help us reconcile those numbers. First of all, the text says clearly that there was a command to abolish the daily sacrifice, and the number of days following that command is given. That is 1,290 days. We have the story of the destruction of the altar. So there were 2,300 mornings and evenings, 1,150 days without a daily sacrifice. Well, how do we understand that? Well, in chapter 8, 1,150 is the number of days without daily sacrifices, from the desecration of the altar to the reconsecration in December of 165. So that's how we get that number. And so if Antiochus commanded the abolishing of the daily sacrifice, as the text suggests, before he destroyed the altar, That would explain the 140 days difference. He gave a command to abolish the daily sacrifice. 140 days later, he destroyed the altar, and there was no doubt left that the sacrificial system could not continue. So the command to cease the daily sacrifice occurred 140 days before the actual desecration of the altar. Now, the altar is reconsecrated in December of 165 BC. I'm telling you how these can be reconciled, how the numbers can be reconciled. I'm not suggesting that the Bible makes this easy and that we can say without any shadow of a doubt that this is exactly how the numbers should be understood. But this is something that makes sense to me. Now, as we think about the reconsecration in December 165, that would give us the end of the 1290, also the end of the 1150, but we have another reference, and that reference is to 1135 days. Excuse me, that should be 1335 days. And so when we have 1335, pardon the error on the slide, please note, that's 45 days after the reconsecration. The reconsecration occurred in December of 165. What happened in the first 2 months of 164? Antiochus died. So the death of Antiochus, very likely 45 days after the reconsecration, blessed is the one who perseveres to the end of the 1335 days. So attempting to summarize quickly again, daily sacrifices abolished. That lasted 1,290 days. That's about 3.5 years. 140 days later, the destruction of the altar, that lasted 1,150 days. And then the altar was reconsecrated, and 45 days later, Antiochus died 1,335 days after the abolition of the daily sacrifices. Well, I know that's a lot to try to take in, and perhaps all of those numbers are not important to you, but I'm simply trying to demonstrate to you that as we read the book of Daniel, as we read the explanation of the angel Gabriel in chapter 9, we do not have to put together extraordinary systems, looking to the end of time, looking to events that are never inserted into the text of Daniel's prophecy, Daniel telling us about the future of God's people with certainty that God will provide, he will oppose all opponents, they will be overcome, and with the coming of one like the Son of Man, the kingdom will be delivered and all the opponents will be overcome. I hope the study has been helpful. Thank you for your patience in a bit longer video. If there are questions, please feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to talk further about any of these events that we've discussed in the apocalyptic prophecies of Daniel the prophet in the years around 551 to 539 BC. May God bless you in your desire to know and to understand the message of the book of Daniel.